What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved comedic legends walks into what he thinks is a friendly late-night interview, only to discover the host has a personal vendetta that's been brewing for decades? What you're about to hear is the explosive confrontation between Eddie Murphy and Jimmy Kimmel that had the entire studio audience stunned into silence, crew members scrambling, and security rushing to intervene. This wasn't just another celebrity spat. This was years of professional jealousy and behind-the-scenes resentment finally boiling over on live television. Make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below because this story gets more intense with every passing minute. The tension was palpable from the moment Eddie Murphy walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel live set that Tuesday evening. The audience erupted in their usual enthusiastic applause, but something felt different. Jimmy's smile seemed forced, his usual animated energy replaced by a cold, calculated demeanor that his regular viewers might have mistaken for fatigue. "Ladies and gentlemen, Eddie Murphy," Jimmy announced, his voice carrying an edge that made the band leader glance nervously toward the production booth. Eddie, ever the professional, waved to the crowd with his signature grin, seemingly oblivious to the host's unusual mood. As Eddie settled into the guest chair, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit jacket, Jimmy wasted no time diving into what everyone assumed would be typical late-night banter, but his opening question immediately set an uncomfortable tone. "So, Eddie, tell me something," Jimmy began, leaning back in his chair with an expression that was more interrogation than interview. "Do you ever get tired of living off your past glory? I mean, when was the last time you did something actually relevant?" The studio audience fell silent. This wasn't the playful ribbing they were accustomed to seeing on late-night television. Eddie's smile faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure, clearly caught off guard by the unexpected hostility. "Well, Jimmy, I think my recent work speaks for itself," Eddie replied diplomatically, though his voice carried a slight tension. "I've been fortunate to work on some projects that have connected with audiences across different generations." Jimmy let out a laugh that sounded more like a snort of derision. "Connected with audiences. Eddie, your last 3 movies went straight to streaming platforms. That's not exactly what I'd call connecting with audiences. That's what I'd call desperation." The camera operators exchanged worried glances. This wasn't in the pre-in notes. The producers in the booth were frantically checking their rundown sheets, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate bit they hadn't been briefed on. Eddie's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Jimmy, I'm not sure where this is coming from, but I came here tonight to have a good time and talk about my work. If you have some kind of issue with me personally, maybe we should discuss it. Off camera." "Oh no, Eddie. I think right here is perfect." Jimmy shot back, his voice rising slightly. "You see, I've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time. You want to know what my issue is? My issue is watching someone who used to be funny coast on old material while real comedians are out here grinding every single day." The audience was now visibly uncomfortable. Some people were looking around confused. Others were pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a train wreck in real time. The warm-up comedian was nowhere to be seen, having apparently fled to the green room when the atmosphere turned toxic. Eddie leaned forward in his chair, his famous smile completely gone. "Now, real comedians, Jimmy, I've been doing this since before you even knew what a microphone was. I've created characters and movies that are still making people laugh decades later. What exactly are you trying to prove here?" "What I'm trying to prove," Jimmy said, standing up from behind his desk and walking closer to Eddie's chair, "is that there's a difference between being a legend and being legendary. You were good, Eddie, I'll give you that. But you've been riding the coattails of Beverly Hills Cop and Coming to America for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to actually earn a laugh." The studio had become so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Even the band members had stopped their usual between-segment chatter and were staring at the unfolding drama with wide eyes. Eddie stood up as well, matching Jimmy's aggressive posture. "You know what, Jimmy? I think I know what this is really about. This isn't about my career or my relevance. This is about you trying to make a name for yourself by tearing down someone who actually earned their place in this business." "Earned your place." Jimmy's voice was dripping with sarcasm now. "Eddie, you earned your place 30 years ago. What have you done lately besides show up to collect paychecks for voicing cartoon characters?" The insult hit its mark. Eddie's eyes flashed with anger, and for the first time since the interview began, his composure cracked completely. "You want to talk about earning respect, Jimmy? Let's talk about how you got this show. Let's talk about the politics and the network deals and all the behind-the-scenes maneuvering that put you in that chair." Jimmy's face reened. He took another step closer to Eddie. "At least I show up every night and do the work. I don't hide behind old characters and hope people still remember when I used to be funny." Eddie's voice was dangerously low now. "Jimmy, I'm still funny. The difference is, I don't have to tear other people down to prove it. That's the mark of someone who's insecure about their own talent." The production assistant near the cameras was making frantic hand signals to someone off stage, clearly trying to figure out whether they should cut to commercial or let this train wreck continue. The audience was now completely silent, watching this personal and professional destruction unfold before their eyes. Jimmy laughed, but it was a harsh, ugly sound. "Insecure, Eddie. I'm not the one who needs to surround himself with yes-men and publicity teams to maintain the illusion of relevance. When was the last time you did stand-up? Real stand-up. Not some corporate event where they pay you millions to show up and do your greatest hits. I don't need to prove anything to you or anyone else," Eddie replied, his voice steady but his eyes blazing. "My body of work speaks for itself. But what I'm curious about is why you're so desperate to diminish it. What happened, Jimmy? Did I not return your phone calls when you were trying to make it? Did I not show up to some event that you thought would boost your career?" The question clearly struck a nerve. Jimmy's entire demeanor shifted, and suddenly the professional mask he'd been wearing throughout his hosting career slipped completely away. Jimmy's face went pale, then flushed red again, like he'd been caught in a lie he'd been telling himself for years. The question about phone calls and missed opportunities had clearly hit something deep, something personal that went far beyond professional rivalry. "You really want to know what happened, Eddie?" Jimmy's voice was shaking now, barely controlled rage seeping through every word. "Fine, let's talk about what really happened. Let's talk about the Paramount deal in 2003. Let's talk about how you made sure certain people didn't get considered for certain projects." Eddie's eyebrows shot up, genuine confusion replacing the anger that had been building. "What are you talking about? What Paramount deal? Jimmy, I have no idea what you're referring to." "Of course you don't remember," Jimmy spat, pacing now like a caged animal. "Why would you remember crushing someone else's dreams? It probably happens so often for you that it all blurs together. But I remember, Eddie. I remember every single detail." The studio audience was completely captivated now, watching this. "Are you serious right now?" Eddie's calm demeanor finally cracked. "Jimmy, do you think I got where I am without facing rejection? Do you think I didn't have doors slammed in my face? Do you think Saturday Night Live was handed to me on a silver platter? I was 19 years old when I auditioned for that show, and I was terrified they'd realize I didn't belong there." The mention of Saturday Night Live seemed to trigger something else in Jimmy. His eyes narrowed and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Saturday Night Live? Of course. The holy grail that some of us never got to touch. Tell me, Eddie, what was it like having that platform? What was it like knowing that every sketch you did, every character you created, was being seen by millions of people who would remember it forever?" "It was terrifying and exhilarating, and the hardest thing I'd ever done," Eddie replied honestly. "But Jimmy, that was 40 years ago. Are you really going to base your entire opinion of me on something that happened when we were both basically kids?" Those kids grew up to be very different adults, Jimmy said bitterly. One of them became a legend, and the other one became a late-night host who apparently isn't worthy of basic respect from his guests. Eddie stared at Jimmy for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Something that looked almost like disappointment. You know what, Jimmy? You're right. We did become very different adults, but the difference isn't what you think it is. The difference is that I learned to take responsibility for my own career, my own choices, my own failures, and you apparently learned to blame other people for yours. The words hit Jimmy like a physical blow. His face went white, then red, then white again. The studio was so quiet that the sound of the ventilation system seemed deafening. "How dare you?" Jimmy whispered, his voice barely audible, but carrying more venom than if he'd been shouting. "How dare you stand there and lecture me about responsibility when you've had every advantage handed to you? Handed to me!" Eddie's voice was rising now, his own anger finally matching Jimmy's. "Jimmy, I grew up in Roosevelt, Long Island. My father died when I was 8 years old. My mother worked multiple jobs to keep us fed. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was handed to me. I earned every single thing I achieved. By stepping on other people," Jimmy accused, "by making sure the competition didn't get the same opportunities. That's not true, and—" "Are you serious right now?" Eddie's calm demeanor finally cracked. "Jimmy, do you think I got where I am without facing rejection? Do you think I didn't have doors slammed in my face? Do you think Saturday Night Live was handed to me on a silver platter? I was 19 years old when I auditioned for that show, and I was terrified they'd realize I didn't belong there." The mention of Saturday Night Live seemed to trigger something else in Jimmy. His eyes narrowed and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Saturday Night Live? Of course. The holy grail that some of us never got to touch. Tell me, Eddie, what was it like having that platform? What was it like knowing that every sketch you did, every character you created, was being seen by millions of people who would remember it forever?" "It was terrifying and exhilarating, and the hardest thing I'd ever done," Eddie replied honestly. "But Jimmy, that was 40 years ago. Are you really going to base your entire opinion of me on something that happened when we were both basically kids?" "Those kids grew up to be very different adults," Jimmy said bitterly. "One of them became a legend, and the other one became a late-night host who apparently isn't worthy of basic respect from his guests." Eddie stared at Jimmy for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Something that looked almost like disappointment. "You know what, Jimmy? You're right. We did become very different adults, but the difference isn't what you think it is. The difference is that I learned to take responsibility for my own career, my own choices, my own failures, and you apparently learned to blame other people for yours." The words hit Jimmy like a physical blow. His face went white, then red, then white again. The studio was so quiet that the sound of the ventilation system seemed deafening. "How dare you?" Jimmy whispered, his voice barely audible, but carrying more venom than if he'd been shouting. "How dare you stand there and lecture me about responsibility when you've had every advantage handed to you? Handed to me!" Eddie's voice was rising now, his own anger finally matching Jimmy's. "Jimmy, I grew up in Roosevelt, Long Island. My father died when I was 8 years old. My mother worked multiple jobs to keep us fed. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was handed to me. I earned every single thing I achieved. By stepping on other people," Jimmy accused, "by making sure the competition didn't get the same opportunities. That's not true, and—"
"You know it," Eddie shot back. "But even if it were, what's your excuse now? You have this show, you have this platform, you have millions of people watching you every night. What are you doing with it besides nursing old grudges and trying to tear down people who never did anything to you?" Jimmy's hands were shaking now, and his voice was getting higher and more strained. "What am I doing with it? I'm exposing the truth. I'm showing people what you really are behind all the charm and the smiles and the carefully crafted public image." "And what am I, Jimmy?" Eddie asked, his voice deadly calm. "What terrible truth are you exposing? That I'm a comedian who's had a long career, That I've made movies people enjoyed? That I've tried to entertain people for the last 4 decades? What exactly is the smoking gun here? Jimmy's face contorted with years of suppressed rage, finally finding their voice. The smoking gun, Eddie, is that you represent everything that's wrong with this industry. You represent the old guard, the establishment, the people who decide who gets to succeed and who gets left behind. I represent the old guard. Eddie laughed, but it was a hollow sound. Jimmy, I was an outsider from day one. I was a black kid from Long Island trying to make it in a business that didn't want me. I didn't have connections. I didn't have family in the industry. I didn't have anything except talent and determination. Spare me the sob story, Jimmy sneered. Once you made it, you became part of the system. You became one of the gatekeepers. And you used that power to keep people like me from getting our shot. The audience was now witnessing something unprecedented in late-night television history. Several people had gotten up and left, uncomfortable with the level of personal animosity being displayed. Others remained glued to their seats, morbidly, fascinated by the complete breakdown of professional decorum. Eddie's expression hardened completely. People like you, Jimmy. What exactly does that mean? People who blame others for their problems. People who can't take responsibility for their own career choices. People who hold grudges for decades based on conspiracy theories. It means people who didn't get handed everything on a silver platter. Jimmy shot back, his voice cracking with emotion. It means people who had to fight for every opportunity while watching others coast on natural talent and luck. Natural talent and luck? Eddie's voice was incredulous now. Jimmy, do you hear yourself? You're literally sitting behind the desk of one of the most coveted jobs in television, and you're complaining about not getting opportunities. You have a platform that millions of comedians would kill for, and you're using it to settle imaginary scores. Jimmy slammed his hand down on his desk with a bang that made everyone in the studio jump. Imaginary? You think my struggles were imaginary? You think the years I spent watching my career stagnate while yours flourished were imaginary? I think your perception of why your career developed the way it did is imaginary. Eddie replied firmly, I think you've created a narrative where I'm the villain because it's easier than accepting that. Maybe, just maybe, your path was different from mine for reasons that had nothing to do with me. The words seemed to hit Jimmy like a physical blow. He stumbled backwards slightly, his face cycling through a range of emotions: hurt, rage, desperation, and something that looked almost like recognition before settling back on fury. Get out, Jimmy said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. What? Eddie asked, not sure he'd heard correctly. I said, get out, Jimmy repeated louder this time. Get off my set. Get out of my studio. This interview is over. Eddie stared at him in disbelief. Jimmy, you can't be serious. You invite me on your show. You attack me personally? You make accusations that aren't true? And now you're kicking me off because I defended myself. My show? My rules, Jimmy said, his voice gaining strength as he embraced the power he had in this moment. I decide who gets to sit in that chair, and I decide when they leave. And I'm telling you to leave now. The studio erupted in confused murmurs. This was uncharted territory, everyone involved. The producers in the booth were frantically trying to figure out how to handle the situation, whether to cut to commercial, whether to end the show early, whether to call security. Eddie stood up slowly, his dignity intact despite the bizarre circumstances. You know what, Jimmy? I feel sorry for you. I really do. You have everything you thought you wanted, and you're still miserable, you're still angry. You're still looking for someone to blame for your own dissatisfaction. Save your pity, Jimmy spat. I don't need sympathy from someone who's been coasting on reputation for the last 20 years. And I don't need validation from someone who's so bitter about his own journey that he can't see past his own resentment, Eddie replied calmly. But I'll tell you what I told my kids when they were young and didn't get something they wanted. Sometimes life doesn't go according to plan, and that's nobody's fault but your own if you let it define you. Jimmy's face turned purple with rage. Don't you dare lecture me about life lessons. Don't you dare stand there and act like you're taking The high road when you've spent decades stepping on people to maintain your position. I've never stepped on anyone, Eddie said firmly. But even if I had, what would that make your behavior tonight? What would that make this public tantrum you're throwing in front of millions of people? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jimmy looked around the studio, suddenly seeming to realize that cameras were still rolling, that an audience was still watching, that this entire meltdown was being broadcast live to the world. "Security," he called out, his voice from shouting. "I need security up here now. You're calling security?" Eddie asked, incredulous. "Jimmy, I'm not threatening you. I'm not being aggressive. I'm just trying to understand why you've decided to destroy your own show for the sake of a grudge that exists only in your head." "The grudge exists in my head." Jimmy laughed maniacally. "Eddie, you destroyed my career before it even started, and now you want to pretend it never happened. Well, I'm not going to let you rewrite history. Not on my show, not on my watch." Two security guards appeared at the edge of the stage, looking uncertain about their role in this unprecedented situation. The head of security was speaking into his radio, presumably getting instructions from the show's producers. Eddie looked at the security guards, then back at Jimmy, and shook his head in amazement. "This is really how you want this to end? This is really the hill you want to die on?" "This is how it ends for people who think they can waltz onto my show and disrespect me," Jimmy replied, his voice shaking with adrenaline and rage. "This is what happens when you underestimate someone you thought you could dismiss." "I never dismissed you, Jimmy," Eddie said quietly. "I never even thought about you enough to dismiss you. And maybe that's the real problem here. Maybe the real issue isn't that I blocked your career. Maybe it's that your career was never important enough for me to notice in the first place." The words hit Jimmy like a sledgehammer. His mouth fell open, and for a moment he looked like he might actually collapse. Then his face hardened into a mask of pure hatred. "Get him out of here," he told the security guards. "Now I want him off this lot, and I want him banned from ever coming back." Eddie looked at the security guards, who were clearly uncomfortable with the situation but were following orders. He straightened his jacket, walked over to Jimmy's desk, and looked directly into the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you had to witness this. This isn't what I came here to do tonight, and it's not what you tuned in to see. Sometimes people carry pain for so long that it changes who they are, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about that except walk away with your dignity intact." He turned back to Jimmy one last time. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Jimmy, but you're not going to find it by tearing other people down." As Eddie walked toward the exit, escorted by security guards who looked more embarrassed than authoritative, Jimmy stood behind his desk, breathing heavily, his face still flushed with anger and something that might have been shame. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, many of them still recording with their phones, others simply staring in disbelief at what they just witnessed. The band members were packing up their instruments, clearly understanding that the show was over in more ways than one. Jimmy looked directly into the camera, his voice but defiant. "That, ladies and gentlemen, is what happens when people think they can come on my show and disrespect me. That's what happens when legends think they're above accountability." He paused, seeming to realize that his words sounded hollow even to himself. The camera caught him in a moment of uncertainty, his bravado cracking just enough to reveal the hurt and confusion underneath. "We'll be right back after these messages," he said weakly. But everyone in the studio knew there would be no coming back from this. Subscribe to the channel and comment below. What do you think really drove Jimmy to this breaking point? Jealousy or something deeper?